Our gospel this morning is Matthew chapter 28, verses 16 through 20. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always, to the end of the age." Now, ever since I was a little girl, being outside has always been a way that I could find peace and connection with God. I love the sound of the birds and the cicadas in the summer. I love the feel of the breeze blowing against my face and through my hair, and the feel of the sun baking into my skin. When I am at the beach, I love to just sit or lie down and listen to the waves as they come in and go back out, and listen to the seagulls as they chatter back and forth, stealing people's food. I love to do my training runs outside because it's less boring. I don't like to do them on a treadmill because I want to smell the fresh air, I want to feel the breeze, and I want to see the nature around me. I want the feel of the ground beneath my feet instead of the feel of a moving platform. And being outside lets me see God's handiwork. The creativity and the love and the beauty that went into our creation is clearly visible anywhere that we look. A world full of lessons to learn if we would but open our eyes and our hearts to what God has to say through us, through nature. I love to bike, hike, swim, run, camp sometimes. And often while I'm working on my sermons, I like to sit on the back porch so I can hear the sounds of nature and smell the rain as it's moving through, or smell the fresh mown grass that's all around while I pray and write and ponder and read. There's just something absolutely essential about nature that gets under my skin and resonates with me and makes me feel spiritually alive and connected. And I wonder if this should be such a surprise. Really, it shouldn't be. After all, we are a part of creation. We too are created beings made by a loving God and placed on this earth to live on and be part of the world and nature around us. We are no strangers to the stories of Genesis 1 and 2. Even the littlest of kids among us know about creation and the light and the dark and the water and the land and the birds and the flowers and the trees, the fish, the cows, the horses. I noticed no one said spiders or mosquitoes, but they too are created. Genesis 1 and 2 are the stories of creation as told by the ancients long ago, passed down generation to generation until they were written. The story that starts when God began to create the heavens and the earth. And I know that many of you probably have never heard it translated that way, when God began to create. Most of the time, whenever we hear it, we hear "in the beginning." But honestly, the Hebrew there is unclear and more closely aligns to this idea that God started something, began something, and that something continued and is still continuing, if we think about it. God began to create the earth, and it was without shape or form, and then God's wind swept over the waters. Just last week, we spoke of God's wind and how the wind blew through the house on Pentecost, and that is the same wind that we know from creation. The Ruach Elohim, the wind of God, the Spirit of God, the breath of God, moving and breathing and present. That same wind present at the beginning, sweeping over the waters, creating all things, inspiring, moving. First comes the light, making day and night. And then the dome, creating the sky, our atmosphere, the area of breathable space that we have, our air. And then dry land, separating the sea from the earth that we know. Along with the land came the plants, the grass, the trees, the flowers that we love. And next came the specific lights, the sun, the moon, the stars that mark our seasons, our days, and our years. And then came the sea creatures and birds. Last came bugs. Could have done without some of them, but I guess that's okay. Livestock, the land animals, and humanity. But humanity was just a little different, just a little. Humanity held a special place. Because we were told God created humanity in God's own image. In the divine image of God, in the divine image, God created them. Male and female, God created them. And at the end of this day, God saw everything that was made and declared that everything was supremely good. And that is something to think about. The creation, everything that was made, was supremely good. Unfortunately, there are many who have taken this narrative and the creation narrative of Genesis, which is a completely different narrative, by the way, and twisted them. They have changed them in a way that declares humanity was supremely good and humanity alone, that humanity is better than the rest of creation, because it says humanity has dominion. But what does that mean? Many think it means we have ultimate rights over creation. They think of dominion in the way of a king lording over his serfs, and we all know that not every king was a good king. Yet that is not the ultimate feeling we get from Genesis 1 or even 2. I go back to that idea that we are made in God's image, because that came first. Let's make them in our image. According to Genesis, we have God's breath or wind, the ruach, in us. To be made in God's image doesn't mean literally, although there are many who believe that, and that creates all sorts of other things with patriarchy and sexism, and that's a whole different sermon and conversation to be had. But when we think about being made in God's image, I think about that idea that we have God's Spirit in us, that image, that creative spark to imagine, to love, to create, to think, to forgive. Because we too are created beings, made in God's image, but are still connected to creation. And I would say that's why many of us feel a connection with God when we are outside, when we feel the wind kiss our face as it blows by, when we feel the rain on our skin, when we hear the birds, when we hear our dogs bark at us or our cats come up and start to purr on our lap. It's why we feel drawn to the beauty of the earth, to beaches or mountains, to paths in the forest, to the sound of the birds and the smell of the flowers. Because in creation, we go back to those first days and we catch glimpses of the imagination and majesty of the God who planted that same imagination within us, the God who created us all. Because in creation, we see God and we see the Spirit and we hear the word that was present from time immemorial to now. The triune God, past, present, and future, seen in the presence of the stars, the sun, the planets, the animals, and each other. And when we think about this original blessing, it ought to change how we think about each other in the world. When we think about each other, we think about the breath of God, God's Spirit present in each of us. Each breath that we take in and out is a reminder of the Ruach Elohim present at creation and that blew through at Pentecost, it brings us life. It reminds us that every single human being bears the image of God. Our friends, our enemies, our neighbors, and people on the other side of the world. Every single one bears the image of God. If we truly live like we all bear the image of God, how would that change our societies? If we all bear the image of God and are created by our loving Creator, how would we do things differently? How would we treat each other differently? How should we be acting differently? How would we respond differently to social issues or that person that we're angry with if we remember that we are all created in God's image and that God's Spirit is dwelling in that other person just as it dwells in us? Similarly, how do we need to rethink our relationship with the created world around us as we remember that we were a part of creation? We didn't exist with God before creation. We were made later. So what do we do when we remember that we are to be the tenders and caretakers, stewards, as it were, over creation? Not one who dominates and plunders without consideration for what it does to the careful balance that God built into the world. And that's hard because we're so used to the idea of there's plenty. But how can we be better stewards of the world, ensuring that it will still be I'm going to skip that word. Ensuring that it's still livable for our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren? What good is amassing all the wealth in the world going to do if our air is not breathable, or if the water is undrinkable, or the planet is just too hot? These are things we ought to think about as Christians. It's not heretical or unfaithful or crazy to think about how we can take care of this planet, just as we take care of each other. This is the world we live on. This is our home. We want our home to be well taken care of and clean and nice. And because we are made in God's image, that means we have the imagination, we have the creativity, and we have the ability to create things that can help us with the task. We know how to decrease our reliance on energies that can create pollution while creating all sorts of new jobs in clean energy. Is it easy? No. But we know what we need to do if we would just try. But we have to be open to that. But there are smaller things we can do as well. Because while we can't change policy as a single person, we can do small things. We can recycle. We can choose to be wise about what we buy and buy less. We can learn to garden and compost. I have a black thumb rather than a green thumb, but some of you are better at gardening. And the food tastes so much better when it's grown in your own backyard. Or at the very least, we can spend time outside. That makes a difference too. We can learn to re-love the nature that is all around us. Go out and volunteer to pick up trash at the beach or along the roads. Take a hike, go for a run, or even just sitting on your porch or in your yard around the fire pit at night, drinking your favorite drink, lemonade, coffee, hot chocolate, and just reconnect with what God has to teach us in nature, if we just look around, reconnect with the rest of creation, look at the stars that we can see, look at the sky, the moon, and think about what it means to be created in God's image. Think about what it means when other people are also created in that same image. You see, our triune God's creation is all around us, and we are a part of it. So my challenge is that we delve further into what that means as we live our lives this week, remembering that when we look at creation, we had a God who lovingly created it, and that when we look at each other, we don't see just our family, our friends, our enemies, and our neighbors. We see people also created in that same loving image of our God. Amen.